The forest has always been a place of ancient secrets, but some secrets are better left buried. Some hungers are beyond human comprehension, waiting in the shadows between reality and myth. This is the story of Maca Rodriguez, a park ranger who discovered that some legends breathe with a hunger all their own. Maca had come to Glacier National Park, seeking silence, a balm for her fractured soul. The tragic loss of her parents in a house fire had left her with phantom memories. The smell of burning wood, the echo of desperate screams. The city had become a suffocating maze of memories, each street corner a reminder of her trauma. The Whispering Pines outpost promised something different. Isolation, healing, redemption. From the moment she arrived, something felt wrong. The forest defied every natural law she knew. Normally, wilderness teems with life, the rustle of small creatures, the distant calls of birds, the whisper of wind through branches. Here, there was only silence. A silence so profound, it pressed against her eardrums like physical weight. Her first night, a cry echoed across the lake, not quite human, not quite animal. A sound that seemed stretched, warped, as if something was learning how to mimic human vocalization but hadn't quite mastered the skill. Maca told herself it was the wind, a trick of the landscape, but deep in her gut, she knew different. During her patrols, she discovered abandoned hiking gear that told a story of its own. Elongated tracks suggested something that walked between worlds, not quite animal, not quite human. The boot she found was torn in a way that defied natural explanation, its leather shredded as if by something with knowledge beyond simple predation. When she reported her findings, the park headquarters' response chilled her more than the mountain air. Their casual dismissal, the practiced neutrality in their voices, suggested they knew more than they were willing to admit. An old journal, buried in the ranger station's archives, revealed fragments of a terrifying truth. Native American folklore spoke of the Wendigoa, creature born from the darkest human desperation, a spirit of insatiable hunger that consumed not just flesh, but something deeper, something spiritual. The journal's previous owner had documented encounters that read like fever dreams, creatures with impossibly long limbs, entities that moved between shadow and substance, hunters that understood psychological warfare better than any human predator. As winter descended unnaturally early, the encounters escalated. Creatures with impossibly long, thin limbs appeared at the edge of the forest, gaunt figures that moved with jerky, unnatural movements. They seemed to be testing her, circling her cabin, waiting for something. When they came for her, it was with a calculated precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond animal instinct. They weren't just hunting, they were hurting, destroying her refuges, cutting her off. The final confrontation came at a fire lookout tower, her last stand against these nightmarish entities. The letter, a towering figure with antler-like protrusions, watched her with an awareness that transcended simple predation. This was a hunt with purpose, a hunger with intention. By destroying the alpha, she temporarily scattered the pack, but the final glimpse she caught told her the truth. This wasn't over. Official reports would sanitize her experience: wildfire, structural collapse, hypothermia-induced hallucinations. But Maca knew the truth. Something watches in those remote woods, something that feeds on more than flesh, something ancient, something hungry, and it was waning. Not all wilderness is empty. Some spaces are filled with things that should not exist. The highway stretches like an endless thread of asphalt through the empty heart of Nebraska, a place where isolation is more than just a geographical condition, it's a living, breathing entity. Harland, Green knew highways. He'd been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades, and loneliness was as familiar to him as the hum of his engine. But nothing could have prepared him for the pursuit that would change everything. It began like any other long-haul run. The terminal manager, Russo, had given him a route that other drivers refused to take. 300 miles of nothing but cornfields and empty sky. Most truckers spoke about the stretch in hushed tones, warning of something that messed with your mind. Harland wasn't one for ghost stories. 20 years on the road had taught him that most fears were just tricks of an isolated mind. The first sign something was wrong came slowly. A pickup truck appeared in his rearview mirror, maintaining a precise, unwavering distance, not too close, not too far, just there, constant as a shadow. Harland tried every trick he knew. He changed speeds, took unexpected turns, even pulled off at a remote gas station. But each time, the vehicle would return, matching his movements with an almost mechanical precision. As night fell, the pursuit took on a more sinister quality. The pickup's headlights became like watching eyes, never blinking, never wavering. Harland's attempts to communicate, to understand, went nowhere. No matter what he did, the vehicle remained a constant, menacing presence in his mirrors. When he finally confronted the driver at an abandoned grain elevator, what he discovered defied all logic. Jeffrey Marsh, the man in the pickup, was something between human and nightmare. Impossibly thin, with skin pulled tight over protruding bones. Marsh approached with a mechanical precision that sent ice through Harland's veins. What happened next would challenge everything Harland understood about human limits. Harland fired his revolver, not once, not twice, but 5 times. Each bullet found its mark: chest, shoulder, stomach. Any normal human would have fallen instantly. But Marsh kept coming. He absorbed the bullets like they were nothing more than raindrops, continuing his relentless advance with an expression that never changed, eyes reflecting light like an animal's. The encounter left more questions than answers. Marsh's body was covered in strange symbols, carved into his skin like an intricate, terrifying language. A notebook found in his possession contained dozens of names, some crossed out, some circled. Harland's name was there, circled without a date, suggesting he was part of something larger, something more horrifying than a simple highway stalking. Local law enforcement was both intrigued and disturbed. The investigation revealed a pattern of similar incidents stretching back decades. Drivers followed, watched, but rarely confronted. Marsh himself was a ghost, appearing and disappearing from official records, leaving behind only whispers and unexplained disappearances. Even after the physical confrontation ended, Harland couldn't escape. Packages arrived with cryptic photographs, newspaper clippings of similar encounters. Other truckers began reporting identical experiences. Something was hunting along those empty highways, something that chose its victims with a patience beyond human comprehension. Harland knew the truth that official reports would never acknowledge. Something moves through the vast, empty spaces of America. Something that follows, that watches, that selects its prey with a method no one understands. And sometimes, on long, dark highways, it finds exactly what it's looking for. Small towns hold secrets deeper and darker than most people could ever imagine. Elkland, Iowa was one of those places, a seemingly ordinary farming community where generations of silence protected a horror beyond comprehension. Leon Delaney thought he'd seen everything during his years as a Chicago police officer, but nothing could have prepared him for what lurked at the edge of town, just beyond the North Creek. When Leon became the town's sheriff, the retired sheriff's warning should have been his first clue. "Keep your head down," he'd said, "and don't make eye contact with anyone named Clef." At first, Leon dismissed it as small-town folklore, the kind of local legend that keeps gossip alive in places where nothing ever seems to happen. But legends, he would learn, sometimes grow from terrible truths. It started with missing hunting dogs. Then came whispers about lights at the old Cleve farmhouse, a decaying structure that seemed to sit just outside the boundaries of normal reality. No one talked about the Cleve family openly, but everyone knew something was wrong. The locals had an unspoken agreement. They stayed on their land, and the town stayed away. Everything changed when 4 local teenagers went camping near the North Creek. What Leon discovered was a nightmare that defied explanation. Jack Morris was found brutally murdered, his body mutilated in a way that suggested something far more sinister than a wild animal attack. The crime scene was meticulously arranged, with a calculated brutality that spoke of something intelligent, something hunting with purpose. The Cleve family was unlike any group of people Leon had ever encountered. Pale, impossibly thin, with teeth filed to sharp points. They moved with an unnatural grace that suggested they were something other than human. Ezekiel Clea, the family patriarch, spoke of an arrangement with the town, a dark bargain that had existed for generations. They provided protection, and in return, the town would occasionally offer sacrifices. When Leon confronted them about the missing teenagers, he discovered a horror beyond imagination. The Cleve house was a museum of human suffering, walls lined with photographs of families that seemed to span centuries, each face bearing the same gaunt, predatory features. Jars in the pantry contained preserved organs, meticulously labeled and stored. The butcher's block in the main room was stained with decades of something darker than simple meat preparation. Amber Wilson, the sole surviving teenager, spoke of the family in hushed, terrified tones. They weren't human, she insisted. They could move with impossible speed, could smell blood from a distance, and had been hunting in these woods for generations. One of the teenagers, Corey, was taken for something special, old blood, they called it, suggesting a ritual far more ancient than simple murder. The chase that followed was a nightmare of survival. Leon fought against creatures that seemed to defy the laws of nature, healing from wounds that should have been fatal, moving with a speed and precision that suggested something more than human. The Cleve family pursued him through the woods, their true nature becoming increasingly apparent with each encounter. When backup finally arrived, the Cleve family had vanished. The house stood empty, as if no one had lived there for years. Photographs, implements, everything that might have proven their existence had disappeared. The official report sanitized everything, a case of rural crime, nothing more. But Leon knew the truth. The town's silence spoke volumes. The mayor resigned. Old-timers who knew the real story kept quiet. And somewhere, in the woods beyond Elkland, something continued to hunt, to wait, to feed. Years later, Leon would still wake up to the smell of wet earth and copper, remembering that something ancient still moved through those quiet farm fields. Something that remembered him, that was always patient, always hungry. Isolation has a way of twisting reality, of blurring the lines between what's real and what exists only in the darkest corners of the mind. For Thomas Riley, lighthouse keeper on the remote coast of Maine, that line would become almost impossible to distinguish. During the winter of 1987, the lighthouse stood on a jagged cliff, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but churning Atlantic waters and rocky shoreline. Thomas had taken the job seeking solitude, running from memories that haunted him more persistently than any supernatural force could. A decade earlier, he'd lost his entire family in a tragic accident, a loss that had hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a shell of a man who found comfort in the rhythmic isolation of tending a lighthouse dot. The first signs were subtle. Strange sounds would echo through the stone tower during the long, dark nights. Not the typical creaks and groans of an old building, but something more deliberate. Whispers that seemed to come from just beyond hearing, scraping sounds that traced the interior walls like skeletal fingers searching for entry. Thomas told himself it was nothing more than the wind, the sea, the natural sounds of a place untouched by human presence. But then the objects began to move. Small things at first, a logbook found in a different place, a lantern shifted slightly from where he was certain he'd left it, a cup turned upside down when he was certain he'd set it right side up. Each occurrence was minor, easily dismissed, yet they accumulated like sediment, building a foundation of unease that Thomas couldn't ignore. The maritime radio was the first to truly unsettle him. One particularly bitter night, as a storm raged outside, the radio crackled to life with a transmission that made no sense. Voices overlapped, some sounding like children, others like elderly men, all speaking a language that wasn't quite human. When Thomas tried to respond, the voices would fade, replaced by a sound like distant, wet breathing. As weeks passed, the occurrences grew more pronounced. Shadows would move in ways shadows shouldn't, sliding across walls without any apparent source, stretching and contracting like living things. Photographs in the keeper's quarters would change subtly. Faces would blur, eyes would shift position. Memories seemed to leak from the images themselves. The storm that arrived in mid-January was unlike anything Thomas had ever witnessed. Waves crashed against the cliff with such force that the entire lighthouse seemed to tremble. Wind howled with what sounded like voices calling Thomas by name. Voices that knew things about his past that no one could possibly know. During the third night of the storm, Thomas discovered the true nature of what inhabited the lighthouse. Standing at the top of the tower, maintaining the light that guided ships through the treacherous waters, he realized the shadows were no longer confined to the walls. They moved with purpose, with intelligence. Shapes formed and dissolved, human-like, but not quite human, constructed from the darkness itself. They knew about his family. They knew about the night they died. Somehow, these entities had access to memories Thomas had buried deep. Memories he'd spent years trying to forget. They whispered about guilt, about a tragedy that was more than an accident, about something Thomas had never told anyone. As the storm reached its peak, the lighthouse became a battleground between Thomas and something that defied explanation. Shadows pressed against the windows, against the very walls of reality. The maritime radio screamed with voices, his family's voices, calling to him, accusing him, promising something terrible. When the Coast Guard finally reached the lighthouse days later, they found Thomas's logbook. The final entries were a descent into madness, cryptic notes about shadows that moved, about voices that knew everything, about a darkness that was alive and hungry. Thomas himself was gone, vanished without a trace. Some say he jumped into the sea during the storm. Others believe something took him, something that had been waiting in the lighthouse long before he arrived. But those who know the area, those familiar with the legends of that particular stretch of coastline, they know the truth. Some places are hungry, some darkness is alive, and some secrets are better left unspoken. The Mojave Desert holds secrets that are best left buried beneath its endless seas of sand and rock. Dr. Elena Rodriguez knew this better than most. As a leading environmental researcher, she'd spent years studying the most remote corners of the American Southwest. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would discover at the abandoned Black Rock Research Station. The station had been defunct for nearly 2 decades, a relic of classified government research that most people had forgotten. When Elena's grant proposed a comprehensive environmental survey of the area, she saw it as a routine expedition. 3 researchers, a week-long mapping project, state-of-the-art equipment, and miles of untouched desert. What could possibly go wrong? Their first night at the station was unremarkable. The facility was a collection of prefabricated buildings, half buried in the desert landscape, protected from the brutal sun by rocky outcroppings. Electrical systems still functioned, powered by long-forgotten solar arrays. Old research logs remained in filing cabinets, covered in a thick layer of dust that told stories of abandonment. It was Michael, the team's geological specialist, who first noticed something was off. While cataloging rock samples, he discovered a series of unusual markings etched into the stone, not natural formations, but deliberate carvings that seemed to follow a pattern too complex to be random. The symbols were unlike anything in their geological reference materials, intricate designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The first truly strange occurrence happened on the second night. Elena woke to complete silence, a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. The desert, normally alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, had gone completely still. Through the window of her research quarters, she saw movement in the distance, shapes that didn't belong. something moving between the rock formations with a fluidity that defied natural movement. When she reviewed the station's old research logs, a pattern emerged. The facility had been studying something far beyond standard environmental research. Cryptic notes spoke of dimensional anomalies, of non-standard biological interactions, of something that existed between states of matter. The more Alina read, the more she realized this was no ordinary research station. Sarah, the team's youngest researcher, was the first to completely disappear. One moment she was conducting ground-penetrating radar scans, the next gone. Number, radio contact, no trace. As if she had been erased from existence, the area where she was last seen showed no signs of struggle, no footprints. Nothing to indicate what might have happened. Michael discovered the first physical evidence 2 days later. In a sealed storage room, behind a wall of classified documents, he found biological samples that defied explanation. Preserved specimens in containment jars showed organisms that were neither plant nor animal, with cellular structures that seemed to change and adapt even in preservation. The research logs suggested these samples had been collected from something discovered deep beneath the desert floor. As days passed, the station itself began to feel wrong. Rooms would shift when no one was looking. Corridors that should have led to specific areas would suddenly end in blank walls. Equipment would malfunction in ways that suggested something was actively interfering with their research. On the 5th night, Alina understood why the station had been abandoned. Something was hunting them. Not in any traditional sense, but something that moved through reality like water through sand. Something that could be in multiple places at once. Something that understood them more completely than they could ever understand themselves. The final transmission from the research station was a series of fragmented audio recordings, distorted voices, sounds that weren't quite human, mathematical equations that seemed to bend the very nature of perception. When the rescue team arrived a week later, they found the station exactly as it had been, everything in place, no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to the research team. Only Elena's encrypted research drive remained. A digital breadcrumb that hinted at something far more terrifying than anyone could comprehend. Something that had been waiting, studying, preparing for a moment of contact that would change everything we understand about reality. Some secrets are buried in the desert for a reason. Some research was never meant to be completed. The mining town's secret Copper Creek was the kind of town time forgot. Nestled deep in the mountains of Colorado, it existed as little more than a collection of weathered buildings and forgotten memories. A ghost town that wasn't quite dead. When Mark Thompson inherited his grandfather's property there, he thought he was getting nothing more than an old mining claim and some worthless real estate. He was wrong. The town sat at the end of a winding mountain road that seemed to twist, impossibly, each turn revealing less of the landscape and more of something else. Mark's grandfather had been a geologist, and the family had always spoken about Copper Creek in hushed tones. Old photographs showed a thriving mining community in the early 1900s, but something had happened. Something that made the entire town simply vanish from maps, from records, from memory. The first night Mark spent in his grandfather's old cabin, he understood why. The silence was different here, not the peaceful quiet of mountain wilderness, but a silence that felt like a living thing. Watching, waiting. Windows that should have reflected moonlight seemed to absorb darkness, creating impossible depths that hurt to look at directly. The floorboards would creak at night, not with the typical sounds of an old house settling, but with a rhythm that suggested something was moving beneath them. Old mining logs told a strange story. Reports from the early 1900s spoke of workers disappearing not in ones or twos, but in entire shifts. Official reports blamed cave-ins' harsh conditions, but the logs Mark found in his grandfather's study told a different tale. Detailed notes described something discovered deep in the mine, something that wasn't rock, something that moved between geological strata like a living thing. The town's original church, now nothing more than a rotting shell, held the first physical evidence. Mark discovered old photographs hidden behind the altar, images that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Miners posed in standard work gear, but something about their faces was wrong. Eyes that seemed to reflect light from impossible angles, proportions that were slightly off, as if the photographs had been created by someone who only vaguely understood human anatomy. Local historical records were maddeningly incomplete. The town had simply stopped existing sometime in 1923. No official explanation, no mass exodus, no documented disaster, just silence. Mark's grandfather's research suggested something had been awakened in the mines, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed, something that existed in the spaces between rock and darkness. As Mark explored the abandoned mine entrances, he discovered markings that weren't geological, symbols carved into rock walls, intricate patterns that seemed to move when viewed from different angles. Some appeared to be mathematical equations, others looked like language, but not any language ever spoken by humans. The deeper he went, the more the mine seemed to breathe around him. Strange sounds began to follow him, whispers that echoed from impossible distances. The sound of pickaxes striking rock, but from tunnels that had been sealed for nearly a century. Shadows would move in the corners of his vision, always just beyond clear sight. Equipment would malfunction, compasses spinning wildly, radio frequencies filling with sounds that were almost speech. The final revelation came during his most extensive exploration of the mine's lowest level. A massive cavern opened up, larger than any geological formation should be possible. The walls pulsed with a kind of bioluminescence, creating patterns that looked like circuit boards, like living mathematics. And at the center, something that was neither machine nor organism, something that had been waiting. Mark never fully explained what he saw in that cavern. The photographs he managed to take were indecipherable, blurs of light and shadow that seemed to defy photographic physics. When researchers finally investigated, they found Mark's equipment, his notes, but no trace of Mark himself. Copper Creek remains on no map, the mine entrances have been sealed, the roads deliberately obscured, but on quiet nights, locals still report sounds coming from the mountains. The rhythm of pickaxes, whispers in a language no one understands. Something moving beneath the earth. Something that was never meant to be discovered. Some discoveries are best left buried. Some darkness is alive. And some secrets have been waiting a very long time to be found. Dr. Rebecca Chen had spent her entire career listening to the silence between sounds. As a senior researcher at the SETI Institute, she was used to searching for patterns in the vast, empty noise of space. But the signals that began arriving in the summer of 2019 were unlike anything she or any other scientist had ever encountered. It started, innocently enough, a series of anomalous radio frequencies detected during a routine deep space scanning session. Most researchers would have dismissed them as electromagnetic interference or some previously unidentified celestial phenomenon. But Rebecca saw something, different patterns that were too precise, too deliberate to be random. The first signal lasted exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds, a complex series of mathematical sequences that seemed to follow a logic just beyond human comprehension. When analyzed, the signal contained nested layers of information, mathematical equations that seemed to describe something more than just mathematical concepts. They appeared to be describing a form of communication, a language that existed beyond human understanding. Her colleagues were skeptical. Years of false alarms and misinterpreted data had made the scientific community cautious, but Rebecca knew these signals were different. They weren't random noise. They were a message, and something about them felt like they were looking for something, looking for someone. As weeks passed, the signals became more frequent. Each transmission was slightly different, but contained similar underlying structures. Computer algorithms struggled to decode them. The more they analyzed, the more complex the signals became. It was as if something was learning, adapting to their attempts at understanding. Strange things began to happen around the research facility. Equipment would malfunction in precise, calculated ways. Computers would generate images that made no sense. Complex geometric patterns that seemed to move when no one was directly looking at them. Researchers reported hearing whispers in languages that didn't exist, seeing shadows that moved against natural light. Rebecca discovered the first physical evidence quite by accident. A piece of equipment left in a sealed lab overnight had been transformed, not damaged, not broken, but fundamentally altered. Microscopic changes to its internal structure suggested something had been communicating with or through the device itself. The signals began to target specific researchers. Personal communications would be interrupted by a burst of data that contained fragments of private conversations, memories, personal information that should have been impossible to access. It was as if something was collecting, categorizing, understanding human consciousness itself. By the time the government became involved, it was too late. The signals had spread beyond the SETI facility. Amateur radio operators, satellite communication networks, even personal electronic devices began to pick up the transmissions. Each iteration became more complex, more invasive. Rebecca's final research notes were a descent into something that bordered on madness. The signals were no longer just communication. They were a form of invasion. Something was using human communication networks to understand, to map, to prepare for something that humanity couldn't comprehend. When the research facility was finally quarantined, Rebecca was nowhere to be found. Her computer systems contained thousands of pages of research, millions of signal iterations, but no explanation. Just a series of increasingly complex mathematical sequences that seemed to describe something arriving, something that was already here. The last transmission detected by the facility contained a simple message, repeated in every known human language: "We are listening. We are coming." The Appalachian Trail stretches like a wound across the eastern United States, a 2,190-mile path that cuts through some of the most isolated wilderness in North America. For David Reyes, it was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime, a 6-month journey of self-discovery that would take him from Georgia to Maine. No one could have predicted the horror that awaited him in the deep, forgotten valleys of the Appalachian Mountains. David was an experienced hiker, having spent years exploring trails across the country. The Appalachian Trail was his ultimate challenge, a journey he'd been planning for years. He was meticulous in his preparation, top-of-the-line gear, extensive research, careful planning of supply points and rest stops. But nothing could prepare him for what he would encounter in the forgotten spaces between established campsites. The first signs were subtle. Small things that most hikers would have dismissed as nothing more than the tricks of an isolated mind. Trails that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Markers that disappeared and reappeared in impossible locations. Sounds that echoed from impossible distances. Human voices that were just on the edge of understanding, then gone. It happened gradually. David began to notice that his maps no longer matched the terrain. Landmarks he'd carefully noted would be in slightly different positions. Trails would curve in ways they hadn't before. At first, he thought it was his own disorientation, the result of days of continuous hiking. But the changes became more pronounced, more deliberate. Other hikers began to disappear. Not in any dramatic way, but simply vanishing between check-in points. David would meet fellow hikers at shelters or camping areas, exchange plans and contact information, only to discover later that they had seemingly been erased from existence. No missing person reports, no trace, just silence. The forest itself began to feel wrong. The deeper he went into the trail, the more the wilderness seemed to change. Trees would be in slightly different positions when he looked back. Distances would compress and expand in ways that defied logical understanding. Sound would travel differently. Whispers would come from impossible directions. Sounds of movement would echo from places that should have been empty. David's GPS and communication devices began to fail in increasingly strange ways. Batteries would drain instantly. Signals would become corrupted with sounds that were almost, but not quite, human speech. Photographs he took would develop with strange anomalies, shadows in impossible positions, figures that weren't there when the picture was taken, landscapes that seemed to fold in on themselves. The turning point came during a week-long stretch through the most isolated section of the trail. David encountered an old hiking shelter that wasn't on any of his maps. Everything about it felt wrong. The wood seemed too old, yet perfectly preserved. Inside, he found journals and equipment from hikers who seemed to have lived decades, perhaps centuries ago. Yet the items looked freshly maintained. As days passed, David realized he was no longer simply hiking. He was being guided. The trail would subtly shift, leading him away from established routes into areas that seemed to exist outside of normal space and time. Encounters with other hikers became less frequent, more bizarre. Conversations would start normally, then drift into incomprehensible territory, with people speaking about places and times that made no sense. His final journal entries became increasingly fragmented, descriptions of landscapes that couldn't exist, encounters with other hikers who seemed to phase in and out of reality, notes about something moving through the forest, not an animal, not quite human, something that understood the landscape in a way that defied human comprehension. When the search parties finally came looking, they found David's meticulously maintained backpack. His camera contained hundreds of photos, each one more disturbing than the last. Landscapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, shadows that moved against natural light, glimpses of figures that were almost human, but David himself was gone. Some sections of the Appalachian Trail remain unmapped. Some areas are avoided by experienced hikers, marked with warnings that nobody quite understands, and in the deep valleys between the mountains, something continues. To wait, something that understands the landscape in ways we cannot comprehend, something that is always watching. The Pacific Northwest Coast guards its secrets carefully. Miles of dense forest meet razor-sharp rocky coastlines, creating a landscape that has swallowed civilizations whole. For Dr. Elena Martinez, the isolated marine research station at Cape, disappointment was supposed to be a routine 6-month ecological survey. Nothing about her background in marine biology could have prepared her for what lurked beneath the waves. The station itself was a marvel of modern engineering, a self-contained research facility perched on a rocky outcropping, surrounded by nothing but the relentless Pacific Ocean and dense, ancient forest. Alina led a team of 5 researchers, each specialists in different marine ecosystems. Their mission was straightforward: document changes in marine life, track oceanic current shifts, and collect environmental data. The first anomalies were subtle, marine life behaving in ways that defied scientific understanding. Entire schools of fish moving with a synchronicity that suggested something more than natural behavior. Sonar readings that showed massive shapes moving beneath the waves, shapes too large to be whales, too organized to be random marine movement. Dr. James Chen, the team's marine mammologist, was the first to notice something fundamentally wrong. With their data, acoustic recordings contained patterns that weren't just noise, they were a form of communication. Complex, multi-layered sounds that seemed to carry information far beyond typical marine communication. When analyzed, the recordings revealed mathematical patterns that suggested an intelligence far beyond any known marine species. The ocean itself seemed to change. Colors would shift in ways that defied atmospheric conditions. The water would develop strange, geometric patterns when viewed from certain angles. At night, bioluminescent displays would create intricate designs that looked almost like language, almost like a message being written across the dark waters. Underwater cameras began to capture images that made no sense. Structures on the ocean floor that were too geometric to be natural formations. Shapes that seemed to move between states of matter, solid one moment, fluid the next. The research team's initial excitement gave way to something else. Fear, confusion, a growing sense that they were watching something that was also watching them. Communication with the mainland became increasingly difficult. Radio transmissions would be interrupted by sounds that weren't quite static, weren't quite language. Equipment would malfunction in precise, calculated ways. Computers would generate images of underwater landscapes that couldn't possibly exist. Cities constructed from materials that didn't follow any known physical laws. Dr. Martinez began to compile a theory that terrified her. Whatever was in the ocean was not just a life form. It was a system of intelligence that understood the ocean as a living organism, a complex communication network that humans could barely comprehend. Something that had been waiting, watching, learning. The final night came suddenly. A massive, underwater event that the station's instruments could barely record. Massive energy signatures, complex electromagnetic pulses, sounds that tore through the facility's hull like it was paper. When the Coast Guard arrived days later, they found the research station partially destroyed, equipment scattered, but no bodies, just a series of research logs, thousands of pages of data, recordings, images that seemed to show something emerging from the ocean, something that was part technology, part organic material, something that looked like it was constructing itself from the very fabric of the marine environment. The official report called it a geological event, a complex marine disturbance, but those who read the full research logs knew something else. Something had been discovered, something that had been waiting in the depths for a very long time, something that was no longer content to wait. The ocean continues to guard its secrets, but something is changing, something is coming. The boundary line, the surveying job seemed straightforward enough when Elena Rodriguez first accepted the contract. Remote wilderness mapping in the dense forests of northern Washington was supposed to be nothing more than a routine geological assessment, a project that would fund her graduate research and provide valuable data for her dissertation. What awaited her was a nightmare that would forever blur the lines between scientific observation and primordial terror. Her team consisted of 3 experienced professionals: Marcus Chen, a veteran topographical engineer with decades of wilderness experience; Julia Hartley, a GPS and mapping specialist; and Elena herself, a geological researcher with a particular interest in terrain morphology. They had been contracted by a private geological survey firm to map an area of wilderness that had remained largely unexplored, a region where dense forests met the jagged edges of forgotten mountain ranges. The first signs of something wrong emerged. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, their GPS equipment began to malfunction in ways that defied logical explanation. Coordinates would shift randomly, terrain markers would disappear and reappear at impossible locations, and the digital maps they relied on seemed to breathe and shift like living organisms. Marcus initially attributed these anomalies to equipment failure, but Elena noticed a pattern that suggested something more sinister was at play. On the 3rd day of their expedition, the forest itself began to change. The trees stood too perfectly, their arrangement too precise to be natural. Branches seemed to bend at angles that violated botanical logic, creating corridors and pathways that guided their movement with an intelligence that felt deliberate. The silence was absolute, crushing in its completeness. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustling of leaves, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against their ears like a physical weight. Julia was the first to discover the markings. Carved into the bark of ancient cedar trees were symbols that defied classification, not quite language, not quite art, but something that existed in the liminal space between human communication and something far older. The carvings appeared to move when viewed from the corner of one's eye, intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with a subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm. When Elena photographed them, the images came out distorted, the symbols twisting and changing between the moment of capture and the moment of review. Their camp became a point of increasing tension. Equipment would be subtly rearranged during the night, moved by hands or forces they could not explain. Compasses spun wildly, electronic devices drained of power in moments, and the boundary between their scientific expedition and something fundamentally wrong began to erode. Marcus discovered tracks that were neither human nor animal impressions in the soft forest floor that suggested a form of locomotion that violated everything they understood about biological movement. The night Julia disappeared was the moment everything changed irrevocably. One moment, she was reviewing map data in their shared tent, the next simply gone. No sound of struggle, no indication of movement, just an absolute void where a human being had existed moments before. The remaining team members found only a single piece of evidence, her notebook. Its pages filled with increasingly frantic observations about something watching them, something that existed just beyond the boundaries of perception. Marcus began to unravel first. His scientific rationality crumbled in the face of experiences that defied explanation. He would wake from fitful sleep mumbling about boundary lines, about spaces between spaces, about creatures that moved through reality like water through stone. Alina tried to maintain her professional composure, but she could feel something watching them, something that existed in the periphery of vision. Just beyond the reach of understanding, their final day in the wilderness became a descent into pure nightmare. The forest transformed around them, terrain shifting in ways that violated every principle of geological stability. Paths they had mapped would disappear, replaced by corridors of trees that seemed to breathe and pulse with an internal rhythm. Marcus began to speak of indigenous legends he had heard years ago, stories of entities that existed between worlds, creatures that could reshape reality through some fundamental manipulation of perception and space. When the rescue team arrived, weeks later, they found only Alina, barely coherent, covered in markings similar to those they had discovered on the trees. She spoke of something that hunted them, something that was not bound by the limitations of physical reality. Her geological samples were missing, her research destroyed, and the area they had been surveying had seemingly been reclaimed by the forest in a way that suggested it had never been touched by human presence. Years would pass, and Alina would be haunted by what she had witnessed. The markings on her skin would fade but never fully disappear, a permanent reminder of her encounter with something that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. In quiet moments, she would hear the whispers, rhythmic, ancient sounds that suggested a language older than human consciousness, a communication that existed in the spaces between perception and reality. Something moved in the wilderness, something that watched, something that hunted, and the boundary between what was known and what remained hidden was far more fragile than anyone could imagine. The Nevada desert holds secrets deeper than its endless seas of sand and rock. For Dr. Rachel Collins, what began as a routine geological survey would become the most terrifying discovery of her career, a discovery that would challenge everything we understand about human history, about what lies beneath our feet. The project was classified, funded by a consortium of government agencies and private research institutions. The underground research facility was buried 3 miles beneath the desert surface. Rachel was brought in as a senior geologist, her expertise in extreme environment mapping making her the perfect candidate for a mission that promised to rewrite scientific understanding. Initial core samples were unlike anything Rachel had ever seen. Geological layers that seemed to defy natural formation, mineral compositions that shouldn't exist, complex organic structures embedded in rock that predated any known life on Earth. Something had been preserved deep underground, something that had been waiting to be discovered. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came during a routine scanning operation. Seismic imaging revealed structures deep beneath the facility, not natural rock formations, but something constructed, geometric patterns that suggested intentional design, architectural layouts that followed principles of engineering far more advanced than human capability. As the research team delved deeper, communication with the surface became increasingly strange. Radio transmissions would be interrupted by sounds that weren't quite static, weren't quite language. Equipment would malfunction in ways that suggested something was actively interfering with their technology. Shadows would move in corners of the underground complex in ways that defied natural light. Dr. Marcus Weber, the team's lead archaeologist, was the first to propose a truly terrifying theory. These weren't just geological anomalies, they were evidence of something that had existed long before human civilization. A civilization, or something beyond civilization, that had deliberately buried itself deep beneath the Earth's surface. The final day of the expedition came with a series of events that defied all scientific understanding. A massive geological event that the facility's instruments could barely comprehend. Massive energy signatures, complex electromagnetic pulses that tore through the underground complex. When rescue teams finally reached the facility days later, they found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, just empty tunnels and research logs that read like the ravings of a madman. Thousands of pages of data suggested something terrifying. Something was waiting beneath the surface. Something that had been preserving itself for millennia. Something that was no longer content to wait. Hey, Verified Whispers community. If you enjoyed this terrifying journey into the unknown, you need to do 3 things right now. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Every subscriber helps us bring more true horror stories to light. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video about the mysterious and unexplained. Drop a comment below. Tell me your own scary encounter. Have you ever experienced something that defies explanation? Your story could be the next one we investigate. And if you want to dive deeper into the darkness, check out our playlist of true scary stories, each one more horrifying than the last. Links in the description below. Remember, some secrets are waiting to be uncovered, some darkness is always watching. Stay vigilant, Verified Whispers family. The underground continues to guard its secrets, but something is changing, something is coming.